So today's actually a really important day for me. This will be a day that I will remember for the rest of my life. I've got no idea what's going to happen emotionally as I talk to you. I know the story I want to say, and hopefully you guys will come along on the journey. I find it really interesting. There's been a lot of talk about men lately. And while I was getting this, what I wanted to say together to talk to you, I looked at this video which analysed what makes a TED Talk successful. It said, do not talk about men. So I found that pretty interesting. And then, there's been articles, there's a recent book that came out called The End of Men. Everyone's prophesizing that this whole change in the way that men are, kind of the stuff that made us successful through evolution, is no longer quite working, and what that's going to mean. And they're using statistics about employment rates and education to tell this story. I'm not going to use any of that today. I'm just going to tell you my story. And so there are no slides, just one guy, funny accent, a fancy shirt, right, telling you about what I've been through and how that's made me think about me. And what's interesting, I was talking to my son about what I was going to talk about this morning, and I've talked to a few friends, there's a couple who self-identify as feminists. So I'm going to be talking about men, and I told them the story, and most of the time they say, well, what about women? My son said, what are you talking about men and boys, what about girls? And I think that's kind of part of the problem, that we can't talk about men without it being about women. And so for you to even come on this journey with me, you need to accept that it's okay for a man to talk about men, and for that conversation to happen without it just being about women. Okay? So let's start. We're going to start with a question. And the question is, how well do you really know the men in your life? Okay. Over the next few minutes, as I talk and tell you my story, the only point of this story is what's going to happen in your minds and the action you take after it. As I talk, faces of men that you know, brothers, fathers, husbands, ex-husbands, and sons, boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, bosses, these faces will flow through your head. Right? And as they do, I just want you to think about how well you really know them. Have you ever caught one of your life's men crying and snatched clarity from his tears? Have you ever seen rage captivate one of your life's men and cast him off somewhere in the distance, flaccid and lost? I believe that the world would be less strange if we stopped making strangers out of men. We tend to know men through their interests and their deeds, and by deeds I mean heroics and their villainies, but we often don't know the rest of them. And they carry around secrets, and those secrets hurt them, and when you're hurt, it's easier to hurt other people. So again, through this talk, I just want you to think, how well do you really know your life's men? And are you able to wade through their interests and their deeds to the rest of them? I'm going to tell you some secrets that I'm ready to shed, some secrets that I've grown up in, and that's why today is actually really important to me. Most people, I write and I talk at events, but most people don't know any of this stuff. And the point is that you go away and do something with this stuff. Back in the 1980s, Sydney, Australia, I used to wake up at 5 a.m. I loved early morning television. I would bound out of the bedroom into the living room and choose delicately, very selectively, something to watch. We had 5 channels, 2 of which weren't even awake yet, right? But it was always something very ponderous. And I would inevitably fall on something like Lost in Space. And it was always a bit of fun. Sometimes I'd get restless in the ad breaks, 5:30 a.m. might come around, and I would change channels. And I might just sit with the test pattern, the ABC, the Australian ABC test pattern. You know, those funny images with the music, you know. There's always a really busy time for me while the rest of the house slept. One such morning, I think I was about 8 years old. I bounded out of bed, I made my grand entrance into the living room, and I looked across the backyard into the garage, and it was empty. So I did, and a couple of years earlier, my dad had left. And I don't know if this is a real memory or I've made it up somehow, but as he left, I grabbed his leg. It's about this tall. Grabbed his leg, And he just calmly told me that he needed to leave. And walked across that backyard into that garage and drove off. That morning when I was 8 years old, sitting in front of the television, or about to get to the television, I looked at the garage and I did what any man of the house would do. House to himself. I sat down and watched television. Lost in Space, maybe Bonanza. That was Pat Boone. I remember watching Pat Boone. These strange American shows from a decade or two earlier. And I waited, and I would flinch anytime there was a noise that indicated that the garage would open. Sorry, it's going to be 10 more minutes of this. But please bear with me. A little later, I don't know, it could have been that day, it could have been days, a man came to the door and gave me a book. And my mum was really shocked that a stranger could knock on a door and give a little boy a book about rape. That book is why my garage that morning was empty. While Mum was getting help, she was shocked that her psychologist suggested that she could become a surrogate. You know, she was a damaged woman, and instead of just helping her, he suggested, this is back in the 80s, that she help men with sexual problems. She was also shocked when she was raped at work a few years later, and we were all shocked a couple of years ago when she was date raped with drugs. She just turned 7. So what's also interesting is that she was a counsellor. So we grew up as kids with her horror stories. And some of those also included the fact that she went through, she lost her first fiancé in a car crash in England, and then she lost her first fiancé in a car crash in England. And then when she had her own car crash, and her face got so smashed up that the judge publicly said she was so ugly no man would ever marry her. This was in the papers. So maybe that rape situations weren't so shocking after all. She was a counsellor. We grew up around her horror stories and her books that tried to make sense of men. As a little kid, I loved their titles. The Peter Pan Syndrome was one of my favourites. It was something I thought I wanted to catch until Mum pointed out that every man we knew had it. But it's always stuck. Mum also ended up running one of the first singles clubs in Australia when being middle-aged and divorced, or middle-aged and single, was essentially taboo. You know, we felt that. Our family was quite isolated growing up. So we grew up with stories of broken men and women complaining about them. I would see women getting divorced from men, popping champagne in our place. And so I kind of grew up as a young man, the man of the house as a kid, seeing these really interesting behaviours and often really negative behaviours. Mum often had boyfriends. I found most of them pretty odd, but and some of that's just a natural reaction as a young guy, as a young boy, seeing another man in your life, especially when you feel there's so much predatory behaviour going on. But you know, when Mum's shock at the end of relationships, often when I saw Mum's shock at the end of relationships dissolving into fear about growing old alone, I kind of just disappeared into my room. So I disappeared into a house whose walls spoke of broken men and suffering women. I disappeared into studies, which was probably the best thing ever actually. When I was 16, 17, I would do 12-hour, 14-hour marathons. I disappeared into poetry. I inked my depressions on paper. I disappeared into the music of angry men, and that actually led me to start the first full-colour hip-hop magazine in the Southern Hemisphere in about 1999, 2000. Sometimes I would cut my arms to see if I was still there. My teachers said that I disappeared into cynicism and sarcasm, and that I needed my rough edges, rounded off. But I never saw anyone standing next to me with sandpaper. 10 years after that man had handed me that book, my sister was holed up in a local house because the local kids wanted to bash her. So I took one of the few mementos I had from my dad, a blunt Papua New Guinean jungle knife, I took it around the neighbourhood pretending that I was going to rescue her when I just wanted to be rescued myself. The next day I broke down in front of my school principal because the tethers that were holding my family together were popping off one by one. I had no clue. I just had blunt weapons. So, most of my life I haven't known what to do with any of this. I knew how to hide from it. I became a workaholic. It started with that studying behaviour, and through my 20s, and mostly through my 20s, I disappeared into working very long hours in advertising agencies, and I published my music magazine. The 5 a.m.s of my childhood had become my bedtime and my enemy, and every time I published an issue, I burnt out. I've been trying to face this stuff in fits and starts for about a decade now. And that's why today is actually really important that I share this story, because I'm determined to turn this corner, because every day this stuff's in the back of my mind. And it affects how I interact with people for the better, and sometimes not for the better. And I'm trying to work out how to deal with it. So, one of the really important things for the men in your life, the first step is realizing that you're not alone. Now, that epiphany reached me in my early 20s through a book my mum actually gave me called Manhood by an Australian author called Steve Biddulph. I'd been carrying around this guilt for, since I had been aware of all these things happening. As the young man of the house, I wondered how I could have done better to protect my mum and my sister. And simultaneously, I wondered, why wasn't anyone there to help us? Why was it just us? And just getting that epiphany that this story is not unusual at all. The telling of it is, but the happening isn't. That epiphany was so useful in helping me gradually start to face what had happened. So, if you're trying to help a man, or you are a man who's got some stuff to deal with, the most important thing is to understand that you're not alone. The second thing that I did is I started to pry into men's lives and listen. I published what was an underground hip-hop magazine, so graffiti, breakdancing, DJing, MCing. It was all about that underground stuff. It wasn't what you saw on MTV. And typically the interviews of those days would talk to guys. Often it was guys, right? It was typically a man's world, at least the scene that I grew up in, and a violent world as well. And typically you would ask these people about their influences. What did you listen to while you were growing up? What's your favourite colour of spray paint, for example? But I started to use these interviews to use the music to talk to men about their lives. One interview I interviewed a guy who talked about his mum, who was a former Black Panther, dying of a heroin overdose. Another time I talked to a guy about how his parents' divorce had affected his crazily frenetic, aggressive music. And what I found is I never had a question refused. I later put the book together, helped put a book together called The Perfect Gift for a Man, which was a collection of 30 man stories. And you just find some really interesting insights about men. They've often got a number in the back of their head, an age in the back of their minds that's somehow related to their father. If their father had a heart attack at 45, all of a sudden a man 41, 42 starts to want to get fit. We had stories from people who'd grown up as orphans, who dealt with bullying, who dealt with self-harm. There's a little movement in Australia with various campaigns like this that happening, trying to encourage men to open up. And a recent one happened called STFU, Soften the F Up. And I spoke to Ihon, one of the guys who put it together. And he said the main thing that he took out of it is that guys want to talk, but they don't think anyone wants to listen. And I found that as a guy. A lot of these moments I've had, I didn't know who to talk to. Families have problems. Keep your families to yourself. Problems to yourself, and your families to yourself. Prying and listening is really important, but there's a catch, right? So this is the third point about dealing with this stuff. There's a catch. Sometimes men don't know how to reach out, and if they start to reach out, often we have conversations shoulder to shoulder, not face to face, shoulder to shoulder, in a bar, watching a game, in the car, facing the road, playing video games. There's not often a lot of eye contact, especially when it comes to this sort of stuff. And the thing is that when men are used to talking about interests and deeds and are known through interests and deeds, that whole hip-hop community that I interacted with, they could talk about rare samples for hours. And they had some pretty powerful, amazing stories behind it, but it was primarily through interests and deeds. So when you're talking to guys, it only takes like a slightly outstretched hand to get slapped away, like, oh, look at look at the game, or look at the girl at the end of the bar, and it's gone. It may not happen again. When my wife was pregnant with our firstborn, apparently a lot of men, at least either emotionally or physically, revisit their dads, trying to work out which part of their dad they want to, maintain and bring into their children's lives. And so I took him away, and my dad's really into postcards. He's a lovely guy. He's really into postcards, and so we went down to Melbourne, and somewhere on that country road, I realised that my dad was really just going to talk to me through interests and deeds, and it hurt. Here I was, finally, mid to late 20s, ready to talk about all these secrets that I had grown up in. And he didn't really want to hear it, but I've come to peace with it. And my dad grew up in World War II in Northern England. The stiff upper lip was a survival skill. It's not for everyone. So this stuff's hard. Along the way, I realized that I wanted to be in the pain. I had to believe that there was beauty in the pain, right? Because so much of my life had been this stuff. One of the most beautiful moments happened when the guy I was with couldn't even talk. My granddad. They put him into palliative care. They knocked him out. And my initial reaction was, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know. I need to just go home. But I decided to spend the last 4 days of his life with him, with as many hours as possible in the hospital. I cuddled him, I held his hands, I massaged his feet, I wrote poetry, and somewhere along those last 4 days, this death rattle kicks in. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but it's this amazing sound of someone taking very deep breaths in, and it rattles, and then out. Those breaths can take 30 seconds, 60 seconds. And to believe that there's beauty in the pain, I decided to stay with him, and every time he exhaled, I inhaled. I just imagined myself breathing him into me. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. So, now I want you to think about the men in your life, and how well you really know them, and whether you're prepared to get beyond their interests and their deeds and wade through to the rest of them. Secrets hurt, and when you're hurt, it's easier to hurt other people. If we can get through this and model new behavior, men, it's okay to talk, then I believe that the world will be a whole lot less strange. So I mentioned my shirt before. I'm actually dressed up. Believe it or not. And well, I've got 2 little kids, love them so much, and they call this shirt my wedding shirt, because every time I go to a wedding, I wear this shirt. I don't even own a suit. And what's funny is that it's actually not my wedding shirt. I bought this to wear to my granddad's funeral. And in that funeral, I read to him this poem that I'd cobbled together over these 4 days. It didn't make sense. There were about 100, 150 people there. It probably didn't make sense to the rest of the audience. After I'd read it and after the funeral had finished, this man from another generation came up to me. Whole other era. A World War II veteran kind of guy, very stoic. And he was crying the way that funerals make you cry, when you cry for all of your life's losses at once before you head outside to the sunlight. He steadied himself, he gathered himself, he shook my hand, and he said to me, I wish I could have talked to my dad like that.